What would you do if you were hiding in the shadows, completely unseen, and watched two men shovel heavy, wet dirt over a living, breathing human being? You'd probably run. You'd call the cops. You'd look the other way to save your own skin. But 19-year-old Tommy Gallagher didn't do any of those things. With nothing left to lose, and the freezing Chicago rain soaking through his ragged coat, he watched the city's most feared underworld boss take what was supposed to be his final breath. When the taillights faded and the makeshift graveyard fell dead silent, this homeless street kid made a split-second, terrifying decision, one that would violently rewrite the rules of the Mafia, drag him into a dangerous romance, and change his entire life forever. The wind coming off Lake Michigan didn't just blow, it bit. It carried the kind of deep, biting cold that settled into your bones and made your teeth chatter until your jaw ached. For Tommy Gallagher, that cold was a constant, cruel companion. It had been 8 months since the medical bills from his mother's terminal illness had swallowed their tiny apartment, forcing him onto the unforgiving streets of Chicago's South Side. At 19, Tommy was a ghost in his own city. He survived on half-eaten diner scraps, slept with a switchblade clutched in his frozen fingers, and made his home in the rusted, decaying husk of an abandoned Pullman train car at the edge of a forgotten rail yard. It was a Tuesday night, slightly past 2 in the morning, when the isolation of the rail yard was shattered. Tommy was huddled beneath a damp wool blanket, trying to ignore the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, when the heavy crunch of gravel echoed through the silence. He froze. Nobody came to this part of the industrial district at night unless they were looking to hide something. Or someone. He crept toward the rusted sliding door of the boxcar, peering through a jagged, rusted hole in the metal. The blinding glare of headlights sliced through the freezing rain. A sleek, black Lincoln Continental rolled to a stop about 50 yards away, its heavy tires sinking into the mud. The engine was cut, but the headlights remained on, casting long, menacing shadows across the desolate wasteland of overgrown weeds and discarded metal. 2 men stepped out of the vehicle. Even from a distance, Tommy could tell these weren't ordinary street thugs. They wore heavy, expensive wool overcoats that fell to their knees. The driver, a towering, broad-shouldered man named Mickey, walked to the trunk. The passenger, a slender, sharp-featured man named Lorenzo, lit a cigarette, the cherry glowing fiercely in the pitch black. "Make it quick, Mickey," Lorenzo's voice carried over the wind, laced with nervous irritation. "If he wakes up before he's under, it's going to be a problem." Tommy's breath hitched. "If he wakes up?" Mickey popped the trunk. With a brutal heave, he dragged a body out, dropping it into the thick mud with a sickening thud. The man on the ground was bound tightly at the wrists and ankles with thick industrial zip ties. His face was battered, slick with a terrifying amount of blood, and a dark, crimson stain spread rapidly across the pristine white fabric of his dress shirt. This was Elias Corvino. Even a homeless kid like Tommy, completely disconnected from the power structures of the city, knew the name Corvino. The Corvino family practically owned the docks, the local unions, and half the politicians in the state. Elias was the ruthless 32-year-old heir who had recently taken the throne after his father's suspicious passing. He was known to be untouchable, a phantom who dealt in absolutes. Yet here he was, bleeding out in the mud, betrayed by the very men who were supposed to protect his empire. Tommy pressed a filthy hand over his own mouth to silence his ragged breathing. Lorenzo took a drag of his cigarette and looked down at his boss. "Nothing personal, Elias," he muttered to the unconscious man, though his voice trembled slightly. "The Colombians made an offer the family couldn't refuse. You were too stubborn, too rigid. It's bad for business." Mickey didn't waste time on speeches. He walked over to a shallow depression in the earth, an old maintenance trench that had partially caved in. It was deep enough. He grabbed Elias by the collar of his ruined coat and dragged him through the mud, tossing him mercilessly into the pit. Elias groaned, a low, wet sound that sent a spike of pure ice straight through Tommy's heart. The boss was still alive. "He's coming too," Mickey grunted, grabbing a shovel from the back seat of the Lincoln. "Hand me the other one. Let's get this over with." Lorenzo threw his cigarette into the mud, grabbed a second shovel, and the two men began to dig. Tommy watched in paralyzed horror. The rhythmic shk thump of the metal shovels biting into the wet earth and tossing it into the trench was the most terrifying sound he had ever heard. The heavy, muddy soil rained down on Elias. Tommy saw the boss weakly thrash, his bound hands twitching as the freezing mud covered his legs and then his chest, and finally his bruised and bloodied face. Elias choked, a muffled, suffocating sound that was quickly buried beneath another heavy shovelful of wet earth. "They're burying him alive!" Tommy's mind screamed. "They are actually burying him alive!" It took less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes to erase a king. When the mound of earth was packed down tight, Lorenzo and Mickey threw the dirty shovels into the trunk and slammed it shut. "It's done," Lorenzo said, wiping the rain from his face. "Let's go take over a city." The Lincoln's engine roared to life. The headlights swept away, plunging the rail yard back into absolute, suffocating darkness. Tommy stood frozen behind the rusted metal of his boxcar, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Logic told him to stay hidden. Logic told him that saving a Mafia boss would only bring a target to his own back. But as he stared at the freshly turned earth, all he could see was his mother's face in the hospital, gasping for air when the ventilators failed. He knew what it was like to be helpless. He knew what it was like to be discarded. "Damn it," Tommy whispered. He bolted out of the boxcar. The mud sucked at Tommy's worn-out sneakers as he sprinted across the rail yard. The rain was coming down harder now, washing away the tire tracks and turning the freshly dug grave into a thick, heavy slurry. He dropped to his knees at the edge of the mound, the freezing water soaking instantly through his jeans. He didn't have a shovel. He didn't have tools. He only had his bare hands. Tommy plunged his fingers into the freezing, packed earth. He clawed at the dirt like a wild animal, tearing away thick handfuls of mud. His fingernails instantly cracked and bled, the sharp rocks hidden in the soil slicing into his skin, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins masked the pain. "Come on, come on, come on," Tommy chanted under his breath, his voice cracking with panic. How long had it been? 7 minutes? 8? A human brain starts dying after 4 minutes without oxygen. The heavy, wet dirt would have suffocated Elias even faster. Tommy dug deeper, his muscles burning with the frantic exertion. His fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. A discarded, rusted hubcap, buried in the topsoil. He grabbed it, using the curved metal to scoop massive chunks of dirt away. He was breathing so heavily, his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. Suddenly, the edge of the hubcap scraped against fabric. Tommy threw the metal aside and went back to his hands, digging furiously. He uncovered a shoulder clad in expensive, ruined wool. He moved up, following the line of the neck, and finally, his desperate, bleeding fingers found hair. He wiped away a thick layer of mud and uncovered Elias Corvino's face. Elias was entirely still. His skin was a ghastly, translucent grey in the moonlight. His lips were blue, his mouth and nose packed tight with wet soil. "No, no, hey, wake up!" Tommy yelled, completely forgetting about the risk of making noise. He pulled a filthy rag from his pocket and frantically dug the mud out of Elias's mouth and nostrils. The man didn't react. There was no rise and fall of his chest. Tommy pressed 2 trembling fingers against Elias's cold throat. There was nothing. "I didn't watch you die just to dig up a corpse!" Tommy screamed at the lifeless mob boss. Tommy straddled Elias's chest. He laced his muddy hands together, placed them right over the center of Elias's sternum, and pushed down with all his body weight. 1, 2, 3, 4. He pumped the man's chest, ignoring the terrifying crunch of what felt like an already broken rib. He pinched Elias's nose, tilted his chin back, and breathed a deep breath into the man's lungs, tasting copper, mud, and death. He resumed the chest compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing. Tears of sheer frustration and exhaustion mingled with the rain on Tommy's cheeks. "Breathe, you stubborn bastard! Breathe!" Tommy brought his fist down, striking Elias hard in the center of the chest. Instantly, Elias's body convulsed violently. The mob boss jerked upward, his eyes flying open. Wide, bloodshot, and feral. He rolled to the side, violently coughing up a horrifying mixture of dark blood and black mud. The sound was agonizing. A deep, rattling hack that tore through the quiet night. Elias gasped frantically for air, his chest heaving as if trying to consume the entire atmosphere. He was blinded by the dirt and the rain, but his survival instincts were terrifyingly intact. Even bound by zip ties, his legs lashed out, kicking Tommy squarely in the chest. Tommy flew backward, landing hard in the mud, all the air knocked out of his lungs. Elias scrambled backward like a cornered predator, his bound hands awkwardly coming up to defend himself. His dark eyes, though clouded with pain and hypoxia, locked onto Tommy. The aura of danger radiating from the man was palpable, even covered in a grave's worth of dirt. "Who sent you?" Elias rasped, his voice sounding like two grinding stones. "Mickey? Lorenzo? Tell me before I snap your neck with my legs." Tommy held up his bleeding hands, coughing and trying to catch his breath. "Nobody sent me. I live here, in the train cars. I saw them bury you. I dug you out." Elias stopped struggling. His sharp, calculating eyes scanned the young man in front of him. He saw the torn clothes, the emaciated frame, and the boy's raw, bleeding fingertips. He looked down at his own half-buried body, the reality of the grave suddenly crashing over him. A heavy, terrifying silence fell between them, broken only by the howling wind. Elias slumped back against the muddy wall of the trench, the fight temporarily leaving his battered body. He let out a long, ragged exhale. "You dug me out," he repeated, the disbelief evident even in his rough tone. "Yeah," Tommy said, shivering violently as the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving him exposed to the brutal cold. "And if we stay out here, we're both going to freeze to death. You need to get up." Elias looked at his bound wrists. "Got a knife, kid?" Tommy reached into his pocket and pulled out his cheap switchblade. He crawled over to Elias and carefully sawed through the thick plastic of the zip ties. As soon as his hands were free, Elias grabbed Tommy by the collar of his jacket, pulling him so close that Tommy could smell the metallic tang of blood on his breath. "If this is a setup," Elias whispered dangerously, "if you are playing a game with me, I promise you, the grave they dug for me will be a luxury suite compared to what I do to you." Tommy didn't flinch. He looked straight into the eyes of the devil and told the truth. "I don't play games. I just didn't want to watch another person die. Now, are you going to help me get you to cover, or are you going to sit here and wait for Lorenzo to realize he forgot his shovels?" A grim, blood-stained smirk touched the corner of Elias's mouth. "Lead the way, kid." Getting Elias Corvino out of the mud and into the rusted Pullman car was a grueling nightmare. The boss was a large man, easily over 6 feet, packed with muscle, and currently bleeding from a deep laceration on his abdomen, a gunshot wound that Lorenzo had apparently inflicted before the burial. Tommy had to throw Elias's arm over his own shoulders, practically dragging the man's dead weight across the rocky ground. By the time they reached the boxcar, Tommy's muscles were screaming in agony. He hauled Elias through the rusted door and lowered him onto the pile of moving blankets that served as his bed. Tommy quickly slid the heavy metal door shut, plunging them into absolute darkness. He fumbled in the corner, his trembling hands finding a battery-powered camping lantern. He clicked it on. The pale yellow light illuminated the grim reality of their situation. Elias lay on the blankets, his breathing shallow and rapid. He tore his ruined shirt open, revealing a brutal bullet wound on his right side. It was a through and through. The bullet had missed his major organs, but had torn through a terrifying amount of tissue. The bleeding was sluggish but constant. Combined with the hypothermia and the sheer trauma of being suffocated, Elias was fading fast. "You need a hospital," Tommy said, his voice laced with panic. "I can find a payphone. I can call an ambulance anonymously." Elias's hand shot out with startling speed, grabbing Tommy's wrist with a grip like a steel vice. "No hospitals," he gritted out, his face pale and beaded with cold sweat. "Lorenzo owns the police captain in this precinct. The second my name hits the dispatcher's radio, he'll know I'm alive. They'll finish the job in the emergency room." "Then you're going to die in a train car," Tommy argued. "I can't fix a bullet wound. I have half a roll of duct tape and some dirty water." Elias's eyes locked onto Tommy's, intense and burning with an unyielding will to survive. "Listen to me," he whispered harshly. "My jacket. Inside pocket. Take my wallet." Tommy hesitated, then reached into Elias's muddy, ruined overcoat. He pulled out a sleek leather wallet. It was thick. "Open it," Elias ordered. Tommy opened it. Inside was a thick stack of $100 bills. More money than Tommy had seen in his entire life. There had to be at least $10,000 in cash. "There's a 24-hour pharmacy about 12 blocks from here, on 43rd, Elias said, his voice growing weaker, each word costing him precious energy. "Take 1,000. Buy gauze, medical staples, rubbing alcohol, and antibiotics if you can steal them from behind the counter. Keep the rest of the money. When you come back and patch me up, I'll give you 50,000 more. Cash, today." Tommy stared at the money. $10,000. He could walk away right now. He could take the wallet, leave the city, and finally sleep in a real bed. He wouldn't have to freeze anymore. He wouldn't have to starve. All he had to do was leave this dangerous, bleeding mobster to die in the dark. It was the smart thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. But as Tommy looked from the cash to Elias's pale, desperate face, he knew he couldn't do it. He wasn't a killer, not even by omission. Tommy pulled exactly $200 bills from the stack and threw the wallet back onto Elias's chest. "I don't need your 50 grand, Tommy said fiercely, grabbing his wet coat. "But if I get caught stealing antibiotics for a Mafia boss, you owe me a lot more than money. Don't die before I get back." Elias watched the kid slide the heavy door open and slip out into the rain. For the first time in his life, the ruthless head of the Corvino family found himself entirely dependent on the mercy of a stranger. He closed his eyes, fighting the heavy pull of unconsciousness. The next hour was the longest of Tommy's life. He sprinted through the dark, rain-slicked streets, keeping to the alleys to avoid police cruisers. He reached the glowing neon sign of the 24-hour pharmacy, dripping wet and looking exactly like a desperate street kid looking to rob the place. He didn't have time for subtlety. He walked in, bought the gauze, alcohol, and a heavy-duty stapler from the aisles with Elias's money. The antibiotics were trickier. He had to wait until the lone, exhausted cashier turned his back to restock cigarettes. Tommy vaulted the pharmacy counter, his heart in his throat, and frantically rummaged through the alphabetized drawers. He found amoxicillin, stuffed 2 bottles into his pockets, and vaulted back over just as the clerk turned around. "Hey, get out of here, you little rat!" the clerk yelled, reaching for a baseball bat under the counter. Tommy didn't look back. He bolted through the automatic sliding doors, sprinting back into the freezing rain, clutching the life-saving supplies to his chest. When he finally returned to the boxcar, he was horrified to find Elias completely unresponsive. The boss had passed out from blood loss. Tommy didn't hesitate. He tore open the rubbing alcohol and poured it directly over Elias's wound. Elias screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure agony, his eyes snapping open as his body arched off the floor. "Hold still!" Tommy yelled, his own hands shaking violently as he grabbed the gauze and the heavy-duty stapler. "This is going to hurt worse than the bullet." It was a butcher's work. Tommy wasn't a doctor. He pinched the edges of the jagged flesh together and fired the stapler. Clack, clack, clack. Elias bit down on his own leather belt so hard Tommy heard the leather tear, the boss's face contorting in unbearable pain. Tommy stapled the entry and exit wounds, wrapping Elias's torso tightly in thick layers of gauze and duct tape to keep the pressure on. When it was over, Tommy collapsed against the rusted wall of the boxcar, his hands covered to the wrists in Elias's blood. He tossed the bottle of antibiotics to the mob boss. "Chew 3 of those," Tommy gasped, wiping the sweat and rain from his forehead. Elias, panting heavily, his skin slick with sweat, managed to open the bottle and swallow the pills dry. He let his head fall back against the moving blankets, staring up at the curved, rusted ceiling of the train car. The bleeding had stopped. The pain was blinding, but he was alive. He slowly turned his head to look at the homeless kid sitting in the shadows. Tommy was shaking, staring at his bloodied hands. "You stayed," Elias said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "You had my wallet. You had your out. Why did you come back?" Tommy looked up, his eyes hardening. "Because you were buried under a pile of dirt, and nobody deserves to die like a dog in the mud. Not even you." Elias studied Tommy for a long, silent moment. The ruthless mob boss was an excellent judge of character. It was how he had survived this long. He saw no greed in the kid's eyes. He saw no fear. He saw raw, unbroken loyalty. Something Elias had just learned was painfully rare in his own organization. "What's your name, kid?" Elias asked softly. "Tommy. Tommy Gallagher." Elias nodded slowly. "Well, Tommy Gallagher, Lorenzo and Mickey think I'm dead. By tomorrow morning. Lorenzo will try to take over the family. He will consolidate power, and he will kill anyone loyal to me to secure his throne." Elias paused, a shadow of genuine fear crossing his normally stoic face. "And he will go after my sister." Tommy frowned. "Your sister?" "Alessia," Elias breathed, the name carrying a heavy protective weight. "She doesn't know about the business. She's civilian. She studies architecture downtown. Lorenzo will use her as a hostage to ensure my loyalists stand down, or he'll kill her to wipe out the bloodline. I can't protect her. I can't even stand up." Elias reached out, his bloody hand grasping the sleeve of Tommy's jacket. "You saved my life, Tommy. I owe you a debt that blood can't repay. But I need to ask you to risk yours one more time." Elias's eyes burned with a dark, desperate fire. "I need you to find Alessia. I need you to get to her before Lorenzo's men do, and bring her here." Tommy stared at the bleeding Mafia kingpin. The gravity of what was happening crashed down on him. He had just crossed an invisible line. He was no longer a homeless ghost haunting the rail yards. He had just injected himself directly into the bloodstream of a Mafia war. "If I do this," Tommy said slowly, "if I go back out there, there's no coming back to a normal life, is there?" Elias didn't lie. He looked Tommy dead in the eye. "No, you step through this door. You step into my world. It is violent. It is unforgiving, and it will demand everything from you. But I swear on my life, Tommy, if you save Alicia, you will never go hungry, you will never be cold, and you will never be a ghost again. You will be family." Tommy looked at his bleeding hands, then out at the crack of dawn beginning to bleed through the rusted holes in the train car. He had nothing left to lose. He grabbed his switchblade, sliding it into his pocket. "Where is she?" Tommy asked. Dawn broke over Chicago like a bruised eye, painting the heavy clouds in sickly shades of purple and grey. The biting wind had died down, but the cold remained, seeping through the cracked leather of Tommy's boots. Before leaving the rusted train car, Elias had pressed a heavy silver signet ring into Tommy's palm, a ring bearing the crest of a falcon, clutching a dagger. "Show her this," Elias had rasped, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "She knows I never take it off. Tell her the falcon's wings are broken. She'll understand." Tommy navigated the labyrinth of the South Side rail yards with the practiced ease of a ghost. He slipped past the rusted chain-link fences, avoiding the early morning transit workers, and made his way toward the CTA Red Line. He didn't have a jacket that wasn't stained with mud and Mafia blood, so he kept his head down, blending in with the exhausted night shift workers and the forgotten souls of the city. Alessia Corvino was supposed to be at SR Crown Hall, the iconic glass and steel architecture building on the Illinois Institute of Technology campus. Elias had explained that she practically lived in the studio during finals week, completely insulated from the violent realities of her family's empire. By the time Tommy reached the campus, the morning light was fully exposing the stark contrast between his world and hers. Students in expensive wool coats and pristine scarves hurried past him, their eyes sliding right over him as if he were invisible. It was a superpower Tommy had hated his entire life, but today it was his greatest weapon. He slipped through the heavy glass doors of Crown Hall, the warm, conditioned air hitting him like a physical blow. The studio was a sprawling, open-plan expanse filled with drafting tables, scattered blueprints, and intricate balsa wood models. It didn't take long to spot her. Alessia Corvino sat at a drafting table near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. She had her brother's striking, sharp features, but where Elias's eyes were cold and calculating, hers were bright and intensely focused. Her dark hair was tied up in a messy bun, and she wore an oversized cashmere sweater with smudges of graphite on the cuffs. She looked like she belonged to a completely different universe, one of light, creation, and safety. Tommy took a step forward, but a sudden, heavy reflection in the glass window stopped him dead in his tracks. Two men had just entered the studio from the southern stairwell. They weren't students. They wore impeccably tailored dark suits over black turtlenecks, their shoulders too broad, their eyes scanning the room with predatory efficiency. Tommy recognized the type immediately. They were Lorenzo's men. The executioners had arrived. The taller one, a thick-necked enforcer named Samuel, reached into his jacket, the unmistakable bulge of a suppressed firearm resting against his ribs. They were fanning out, moving methodically through the aisles of drafting tables, blocking the main exits. Tommy's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribcage. He had seconds. He dropped low, utilizing the labyrinth of tall drafting partitions and massive architectural models to mask his approach. He moved completely silently, a skill perfected by months of hiding from aggressive transit cops. When he was just 10 feet from Alessia, he grabbed a heavy metal T-square from an abandoned desk and hurled it across the room. It smashed into a towering glass display case on the far side of the studio. The shattering glass echoed like a gunshot. Samuel and his partner instantly drew their weapons beneath their coats, spinning toward the noise and rushing the far aisle. Taking the opening, Tommy lunged. He practically dove under Alessia's drafting table, popping up right beside her chair. Before she could scream, he clamped his raw, blistered hand over her mouth. Alessia thrashed violently, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She grabbed her heavy metal compass, raising it to stab him in the neck. "Look at the ring!" Tommy hissed, his voice a frantic whisper, pinning her arm with his free hand. He shoved his other hand right in front of her face. "Look at the ring! Elias sent me!" Alessia froze. The heavy silver falcon gleamed under the harsh fluorescent studio lights. She recognized it instantly. The panic in her eyes shifted to profound confusion as she took in the sight of the boy holding her. A filthy, shivering teenager with dirt smeared across his hollow cheeks and dried blood beneath his fingernails. Tommy slowly removed his hand from her mouth. "The falcon's wings are broken," he whispered rapidly. "Your brother is bleeding out in a train car. Lorenzo killed him, or tried to. Those two men in the suits are here to finish the bloodline." Alessia's breath hitched. Her entire world, the safe, naive, insulated bubble she had meticulously built, shattered in a fraction of a second. But to Tommy's absolute shock, she didn't faint. She didn't scream. She inherited the same terrifying, ice-cold composure as her brother. She peeked through the gap in the partition. Samuel was kicking aside the broken glass, realizing it was a distraction, his face twisting into a furious scowl. "They have the main doors blocked," Alessia whispered, her voice trembling but miraculously controlled. "There's a service elevator in the basement that connects to the old steam tunnels beneath State Street. But we have to cross the open floor to get to the stairs." "We don't cross the floor," Tommy said, his eyes scanning the room. He pointed to the massive, intricate model of a skyscraper sitting on a rolling cart nearby. "Push that into the aisle. When I say go, we run." Alessia didn't hesitate. She grabbed the cart holding her semester's worth of meticulous work and shoved it violently into the main walkway. It crashed into a row of drafting stools with a deafening clatter. "Hey!" Samuel barked from across the room, spotting them. He raised his weapon. "Go!" Tommy yelled. He grabbed Alessia's hand, his rough, blistered skin contrasting sharply with her soft fingers. They bolted towards the northern stairwell. A silenced gunshot thwipped through the air, shattering the plaster wall mere inches from Tommy's head. Showered in white dust, Tommy pulled Alessia through the heavy fire doors, slamming them shut, just as a second bullet dented the metal frame. They flew down the concrete stairs, skipping 3 steps at a time. The sound of heavy, polished dress shoes pounded on the landing above them. The hitmen were fast. "The tunnels!" Alessia gasped, leading him through the labyrinthine basement of the engineering building. She swiped a keycard against a rusted security door, hauling it open. A blast of hot, sulfur-smelling air washed over them. Tommy pushed her inside and threw his entire weight against the heavy iron door, dragging the massive rusted deadbolt across, just as something heavy slammed into the other side. The impact rattled Tommy's teeth, but the iron held. Muffled curses echoed from the other side of the door. "They can't get through that without a torch," Tommy panted, sliding down the door until he hit the damp concrete floor. He looked up at Alessia, his chest heaving. "Are you okay?" Alessia stood in the dim, flickering light of the steam tunnel. She looked at the blood on Tommy's coat, her brother's blood. The reality of the situation finally breached her defenses, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice cracking for the first time. "Why are you doing this?" "I'm just a guy who hates seeing people get buried," Tommy said, pushing himself back to his feet. "Come on, we have to keep moving. The rats in this city have better tracking skills than the cops, and Lorenzo's men are worse than rats." The journey back to the south side took hours. Tommy couldn't risk the main transit lines anymore, knowing Lorenzo's network of corrupt transit cops would be actively hunting a girl matching Alessia's description. Instead, they navigated the city's hidden veins, the abandoned service tunnels, the crumbling alleys behind the industrial parks, and the forgotten stretches beneath the L-train tracks. By the time they reached the rusted husk of the Pullman train car, the afternoon sky had darkened into a bruised twilight, and a freezing drizzle had begun to fall again. Tommy slid the heavy metal door open. The metallic screech echoed loudly in the desolate rail yard. "Elias!" Tommy called out, his voice tight with dread. A weak, rattling cough answered from the darkness. Tommy clicked on the camping lantern. Alessia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Elias was slouched against the corrugated metal wall, his face the color of wet ash. The makeshift bandages Tommy had applied were soaked through with fresh blood, and his breathing was shallow and erratic. The invincible Mafia king looked incredibly small, broken by the very empire he ruled. "Alessia," Elias whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his pale lips. You look terrible." "Shut up," she sobbed, rushing to his side and dropping to her knees on the filthy floorboards. She carefully touched his face, her hands trembling. "You promised me, Elias. You promised me you had it under control. You said Lorenzo was loyal." "I was wrong," Elias rasped, his eyes shifting to Tommy, who was standing awkwardly by the door. "And you actually did it. You pulled off a miracle, kid. He needs real medical attention, Elias," Alessia said, panic rising in her throat as she inspected the bloody duct tape bandages. "This is a slaughterhouse job. If infection doesn't kill him, the blood loss will." "No hospitals," Elias ordered, his voice suddenly firm despite his weakness. "Lorenzo has eyes everywhere. The second I'm in a system, we're all dead." Alessia looked around the squalid train car, the damp blankets, the empty tin cans, the absolute destitution. "We can't stay here. It's freezing. He won't survive the night." "She's right," Tommy said quietly. He walked over to a small, hidden compartment he had carved out beneath the floorboards and pulled out a clean, albeit faded, wool blanket, draping it over Elias's shivering shoulders. "They'll start sweeping the homeless camps by nightfall. Lorenzo isn't stupid. He knows I pulled Elias out of the mud. He knows I'm a street kid. He's going to offer a bounty to the gangs, or he'll just send his suits to burn the camps down until they find us." Alessia looked up at Tommy, truly looking at him for the first time. Beneath the grime and the exhaustion, she saw a boy who had been forced to become a man far too early. She noticed his hands, raw, blistered, and deeply cut from digging her brother out of a grave with nothing but his fingers and a piece of metal. She reached into her designer messenger bag and pulled out a small, pristine first aid kit she carried for architectural modeling accidents. "Sit down," Alessia ordered Tommy, her voice softening. "I'm fine," Tommy deflected, stepping back. "We need to figure out a move." "Sit," she repeated, gesturing to an overturned milk crate. Tommy reluctantly sat. Alessia knelt in front of him, taking his large, calloused and bleeding hands into her soft ones. The contrast was stark. She poured an antiseptic wash over his torn knuckles. Tommy winced, his jaw clenching, but he didn't pull away. "You tore your hands to shreds for a man you didn't even know," Alessia said softly, carefully applying antibacterial ointment and wrapping his fingers in clean white gauze. "Why? Men in my world kill for money or power. You risked your life for nothing." Tommy watched her carefully wrap his hand. The proximity, the gentle touch, the smell of lavender and expensive soap radiating from her. It was intoxicating to a boy who hadn't been touched with kindness in nearly a year. "When my mum was sick," Tommy said, his voice dropping to a low, painful whisper, "nobody looked at us. The doctors, the landlords, the people on the street. They just looked right through us, like we were already ghosts. I promised myself I would never look through someone else. I couldn't just walk away." Alessia looked up, her dark eyes locking onto his. In the dim, flickering light of the lantern, the Mafia princess and the homeless outcast shared a profound, electric moment of understanding. She saw the quiet, fierce nobility in him, a stark contrast to the ruthless, calculating men she had been surrounded by her entire life. For a fleeting second, the danger outside faded away. Elias's rough cough broke the spell. "Touching moment," Elias muttered, his eyes heavy. "But Tommy is right. Lorenzo is going to squeeze the streets. We have no soldiers, no money, and no safe houses that Lorenzo doesn't know about." "We need leverage," Tommy said, pulling his bandaged hands back and standing up, the strategic gears in his mind turning. "Lorenzo thinks he's fighting a ghost. He's looking for a Mafia rival, but he's fighting me. And he doesn't know my world." Tommy paced the narrow length of the boxcar. "Lorenzo's power is in his money and his muscle. But down here, in the dirt, the suits stick out. They make noise. My people, the ones who sleep under the bridges, the ones who dig through the trash outside his fancy restaurants. We see everything. We hear everything. We are invisible." Alessia watched Tommy, a spark of genuine admiration igniting in her chest. The underdog wasn't cowering. He was preparing to bite back. "What are you thinking, Tommy?" Elias asked, a sliver of hope piercing through his pain. "I'm thinking hard karma," Tommy said, a dangerous glint in his eye. "Lorenzo threw you away like garbage. So we're going to use the garbage to take him down. I need a payphone, and I need you to tell me exactly where Lorenzo keeps his ledgers, the physical ones, the ones that prove he's been stealing from the other families." Elias smirked, his respect for the street kid solidifying into awe. He keeps them in a vault at the meatpacking plant on Halstead. But it's a fortress, kid. You can't just walk in." "I don't have to," Tommy replied, grabbing his wet coat. "I just have to make sure the right people know he's vulnerable. Stay here. Keep him warm." Before Tommy could leave, Alessia stood up and grabbed his arm. "You're going to get yourself killed." "I survived a Chicago winter in a tin can, Alessia," Tommy said, offering her a reckless, confident smile that made her heart skip a beat. "A couple of guys in expensive suits don't scare me. I'll be back." He slid the door shut, disappearing into the violent, rainy night. He was about to mobilize an army that the Mafia didn't even know existed. The wind howling through the concrete canyons of downtown Chicago felt different to Tommy tonight. It didn't feel like a punishment anymore. It felt like a weapon. He didn't head toward the glittering high-rises or the wealthy districts. Instead, he descended into the subterranean belly of the city, Lower Wacker Drive. This was a place where the sunlight never reached, a sprawling, exhaust-choked labyrinth of concrete pillars and shadows where the city's forgotten souls made their homes in cardboard boxes and stolen shopping carts. This was Tommy's kingdom. He walked up to a cluster of trash can fires. A dozen men and women, bundled in layers of filthy, donated coats, looked up. They recognized him immediately. To the wealthy elite, they were invisible nuisances. But to Tommy, they were Sullivan, a former structural engineer whose life unraveled after a brutal divorce. Arthur, a disgraced city planner who knew the electrical grid better than the mayor. And Maggie, who had ears on every alleyway conversation from the Gold Coast to the South Side. "Tommy," Arthur rasped, coughing into a stained handkerchief. "Thought the cold finally took you, kid." "Not yet, Arthur," Tommy said, stepping into the dim, orange light of the fire. "But I need your help, all of you, the men in the suits, the ones who run the docks and the meatpacking plants. They're looking for me, and they're going to tear apart every camp in this city until they find me." A murmur of unease rippled through the gathered crowd. They all knew the Corvino enforcers. They had all been kicked awake by them, or had their meager belongings tossed into the river for sleeping too close to a Mafia-owned warehouse. "Well, what do you want us to do, kid?" Sullivan asked, his sharp eyes narrowing. "We don't have guns. We don't have power." "We have numbers," Tommy corrected, his voice echoing off the concrete pillars with a fierce, magnetic authority. "And we are invisible. Lorenzo thinks he's fighting a phantom. I want to show him what a ghost town really looks like." Tommy laid out the plan. It was reckless, brilliant, and relied entirely on the arrogance of their enemy. 2 hours later, the Halstead meatpacking plant, Lorenzo's heavily guarded fortress and the center of his new, violently acquired empire, was plunged into sudden, terrifying chaos. It started with the garbage trucks. 3 massive, rusted municipal trucks, hot-wired by Sullivan and driven by men who had nothing to lose, suddenly careened down Halstead Street, smashing through the heavy iron gates of the plant and effectively barricading the main exits. The deafening crash brought Lorenzo's armed guards rushing out into the freezing courtyard, their weapons drawn. But there was nobody to shoot. The drivers had slipped out the side doors into the shadows before the trucks even stopped moving. Then came the darkness. Arthur, using a pair of stolen rubber gloves and a crowbar, bypassed the main junction box down the street, plunging the entire facility into a total blackout. The backup generators immediately whined to life, but they only powered the essential freezer units, leaving the administrative offices and the hallways bathed in disorienting, blood-red emergency lighting. Inside the plant's fortified upper office, Lorenzo was practically foaming at the mouth. He slammed his fist onto a mahogany desk, screaming at his capo, "Samuel, what the hell is going on out there? Secure the perimeter. If it's the O'Bannon Syndicate making a move, I want them slaughtered." Lorenzo was so focused on the chaos outside that he never considered the threat coming from beneath his feet. While the guards rushed the loading docks, Tommy used the distraction to slip through a rusted, forgotten ventilation shaft at the rear of the building. a route Arthur had mapped out years ago. He dropped silently into the pitch-black hallway leading to Lorenzo's private vault. Elias had given him the combination, April 12th, 88, the date Lorenzo had sworn his blood oath to the Corvino family. The irony wasn't lost on Tommy. He spun the heavy steel dial. The locking mechanism clicked with a heavy, satisfying thud. Tommy hauled the heavy vault door open and shined his small flashlight inside. There, resting on a velvet-lined shelf, alongside stacks of illicit cash, were 3 black leather ledgers. The physical proof that Lorenzo had been skimming millions from the syndicate's shared accounts for years. Tommy shoved the ledgers into his backpack. As he turned to leave, the heavy metal door to the hallway violently slammed open. Samuel stood in the doorway, a tactical flashlight attached to his suppressed pistol blinding Tommy. The enforcer's cruel smile stretched across his face. "Well, well," Samuel purred, aiming the gun squarely at Tommy's chest. "A little street rat trying to steal from the king. Lorenzo is going to enjoy skinning you alive." Tommy didn't panic. He looked past Samuel, staring into the dark hallway, and gave a sharp, piercing whistle. Suddenly the fire sprinkler system above Samuel's head erupted, drenching the enforcer in freezing, high-pressure water. Arthur had tripped the manual override. Samuel gasped, his vision obscured for a fraction of a second. It was all Tommy needed. He lunged forward, using his momentum to slam the heavy steel vault door directly into Samuel's shoulder. The enforcer roared in pain, dropping his weapon as the bone cracked loudly. Tommy didn't look back. He bolted down the blood-red hallway, disappearing into the maze of the meatpacking plant and melting back into the shadows of Chicago. He had the weapon that would destroy an empire. The sun was just beginning to break over the violent, choppy waters of Lake Michigan when the trap snapped shut. Tommy didn't take the ledgers to the police. Elias had taught him that the law in this city was bought and paid for. Instead, Tommy used Maggie's vast street network to deliver photocopied pages of the ledgers directly to the doorsteps of the 4 other major syndicate bosses in Chicago. By 8 a.m., Lorenzo's empire was already burning to the ground. The other families realized they had been robbed of millions. Lorenzo's lucrative trade routes were blockaded. His corrupt politicians suddenly stopped answering his calls, and the very enforcers he had paid to hunt down Elias began abandoning their posts out of sheer self-preservation. But Lorenzo was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. Realizing that the leak had to have come from the street rat who saved Elias, Lorenzo deduced their hiding spot. He bypassed his dwindling army and drove to the South Side rail yards himself, heavily armed and vibrating with a psychotic rage. Inside the rusted Pullman car, Tommy was packing the last of the medical supplies into Alessia's bag. Elias was sitting up, his color returning, the antibiotics and rest finally working their magic. "The streets are quiet," Tommy said, looking out the rusted hole in the boxcar. "Maggie sent word. The syndicate declared a hit on Lorenzo. He has no men left." Alessia smiled, a bright, breathtaking expression of pure relief. She walked over to Tommy, closing the distance between them. Her soft, unblemished hand reached up, gently tracing the line of his bruised jaw. "You did it," she whispered, her dark eyes filled with an overwhelming mixture of gratitude and something much deeper, much more electric. "You saved him. You saved me." Tommy swallowed hard, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "I couldn't let him win, Alessia." She leaned in, her lips mere inches from his, the scent of lavender cutting through the damp, metallic air of the train car. But before their lips could meet, the heavy metal door of the boxcar was violently blown off its rusted tracks by a shotgun blast. The deafening explosion threw Tommy and Alessia backward onto the dirty floorboards. Sunlight poured into the dark interior, blinding them. Stepping through the smoke and twisted metal was Lorenzo. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot and manic. He racked the pump of his shotgun, aiming it directly at Tommy's head. "You destroyed my life!" Lorenzo screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You worthless piece of street trash. I had the city in the palm of my hand, and you threw it away for a dead man." Elias, despite his agonizing wound, tried to push himself off the floor to shield his sister, but his legs betrayed him. "Lorenzo, stop!" Elias choked out. "This is between you and me. Leave them out of it." "You're already a ghost, Elias," Lorenzo spat, keeping the gun trained on Tommy. "I'm going to blow this kid's chest open, and then I'm going to make you watch what I do to your sister before I finally put you back in the dirt." Lorenzo's finger tightened on the trigger. "You're right, Lorenzo," Tommy said quietly, his voice eerily calm, despite the barrel of the gun pointed at his face. "You had all the power, but you made one massive mistake." "Oh yeah?" Lorenzo sneered. "What's that, rat? You didn't look behind you." Lorenzo frowned. Suddenly the gravel outside the train car crunched. Lorenzo spun around, raising his weapon. Standing in the dreary morning light, forming a silent, impenetrable semicircle around the wrecked entrance of the boxcar, were 50 people. They held crowbars, heavy chains, and rusted pipes. They were the homeless, the discarded, the invisible army of Chicago. Sullivan stood at the front, his face a mask of hard, unforgiving stone. Lorenzo's bravado shattered. He took a terrified step back into the boxcar, realizing too late that his arrogance had led him directly into a trap. He raised his shotgun to fire into the crowd, but before he could pull the trigger, Tommy lunged. Tommy slammed his shoulder into Lorenzo's knees, sweeping the traitor's legs out from under him. The shotgun blasted harmlessly into the metal ceiling. Lorenzo hit the floor hard, dropping the weapon. Before he could recover, Sullivan and 3 other men rushed into the car, grabbing Lorenzo by his expensive lapels and dragging him brutally out into the mud. Lorenzo screamed, kicking and thrashing as the invisible ghosts of the city surrounded him, pulling him away from the train car and dragging him toward a waiting, unmarked van that belonged to the rival syndicate families. Lorenzo had dug a grave for Elias, but his own karma had just swallowed him whole. The screams faded into the distance, leaving the rail yard in a profound, ringing silence. Inside the boxcar, Tommy slowly stood up, brushing the dirt from his jeans. He looked at Elias, who was staring back at him with a look of absolute, unshakable respect. "I told you," Tommy breathed, a tired but triumphant smile breaking across his face. "Hard karma." Alessia scrambled to her feet. She didn't hesitate this time. She threw her arms around Tommy's neck, pulling him into a fierce, desperate kiss. It was a collision of 2 completely different worlds, born in the mud and blood of a Mafia war. But it felt incredibly right. Tommy wrapped his arms tightly around her waist, kissing her back, the cold of the city finally melting away. Elias watched them, a grim chuckle escaping his lips, though it made his stitched ribs ache. "All right, kid," the Mafia boss said softly. "You win. Get me out of this tin can. I've got a promise to keep, and I need to buy you a suit." Tommy Gallagher had started the week as a frozen ghost, utterly invisible to the world. But as he walked out of the rail yard, with a Mafia king leaning on his shoulder and the woman he loved holding his hand, he knew one thing for certain. He would never be invisible again. Wow, what an incredible journey. If you felt your heart pounding during Tommy's desperate rescue in the freezing mud, or cheered when the invisible ghosts of the city finally brought a corrupt Mafia kingpin to his knees, you are certainly not alone. This story proves that true power doesn't come from stolen money, expensive suits, or cruel violence. It comes from courage, loyalty, and standing up for what is right when everyone else looks away. We pour our absolute hearts into bringing you these intense, dramatic, and romantic real-life inspired stories, and your ongoing support means the world to our team. If you want to hear more thrilling tales of hard karma, passionate romance, and street underdogs defying the impossible odds, please hit that like button right now. Share this video with your friends who love a great twist, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel today. Thank you all.